Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversation. I just spotted you, Craig. It's it's our birthday, and Craig seems to be celebrating in style.
I have cake too. Woo!
Cake as well, little Easter cake, excellent. I'm loving the look, Craig.
Yeah, well, we're absolutely waiting for climate change down here. We're looking for global warming. We're the coldest state in Australia, and we're just looking forward to it. So I'm getting prepared.
I could do. I know the feeling because it's currently been snowing the last few days in the UK. In March, should be getting to spring, and we've got our sort of pretty close to sort of 8 inches of snow over here. So maybe even a bit more. So yeah, it's pretty cold at the moment. But never mind. It is our second birthday. We're now 2 years old, which is wonderful. And way back when we started, it was just me and John, and we sort of had the content down, but we didn't really have a clue as to what we were doing in terms of media and technology and all that kind of stuff. So we've certainly grown since then, both in team as well as in skills, mainly thanks to Sam. So it's great to have you all with us. I know we've got a lot of people in the chat already, which is wonderful. We've got some people watching. That's fantastic. It's great to have you all here. Join us on this birthday celebration as we revisit a topic that we've dealt with many times on Creation Conversations, particularly around our birthday, right? And this is actually what we started the whole Creation Conversation stuff about way back when we filmed and produced this DVD here, Fire and Ice, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Anyway, let's briefly run around the table and see how we're all doing. John and Diane, how are you doing in Brisbane? You're together in person again, I think.
Yes, Diane, you're actually up for the whole next week. What are you here for?
Oh, we've got a really exciting thing to do because we've now been given some space to have a museum in Brisbane. So we can put out a tiny percentage of the multitudinous fossils that we've got
In
collected.
fact, Diane, when we finish this program, brief break, and then over to check with the builders who are putting up cabinets on the wall today. And by the way, folks, this is what you call totally unexpected. We've been praying for 30 years for a place. We've investigated here, investigated there, and all of a sudden, and I think we've shared a bit of this, a businessman came and said, I've got a building, I've got a program. Hey, how about you use the front of the building for your museum? I like your work and you can have it for free and we'll pay for the fittings. And I thought, Diane, we can't ignore that offer, can we?
That's right. That's an offer you can't refuse.
Yeah. So in the next few hours, we'll be putting fossils out on display because we have our first sort of supporters come along on Sunday afternoon, see what we've achieved with 2 weeks. That's about all the time we've had. And get behind it and support it and bring your friends and your enemies. So that's what really our ministry is going. So a very busy day coming up, and praise the Lord you're up here, Diane. That'll do for us at the moment.
Great stuff. Good update. Good report. Glenn, how are you doing over in the States?
Doing great. Much better than last Friday. I was at my brother-in-law's. My wife and I were and we didn't have any electricity. Storms came through, but it wouldn't have mattered if we would have been back here in Tennessee. They didn't have electricity. Major storms came through the area. So much better this week.
Well, we haven't had as many major storms as I'm sure you've had in your part of the world, but here in the UK, we have been without sort of mobile signal and internet and stuff for a little while, thanks to the heavy snowfall and all of that. It's sort of, we're not really prepared in the UK for extremes of weather, so everything seems to go downhill very quickly.
It's sort of a running joke, isn't it? It's sort of like one snowflake falls on the ground, and then the entire country just grinds to a halt.
Stops, yeah, trains, Wi-Fi, everything just can't cope. But anyway, there we are. Craig, you're obviously having a wonderful time in Tasmania. How are you doing?
Well, in actual fact, it snowed during the week down here in the mountains. So even though it's summer down here, but we've had a good time at the museum this week. On Tuesday, I had a couple come in right at the end of the day just to buy some fossils in the shop. And 2 hours later, they left after coming through the museum in the end and really being intrigued by what we were showing. They left with resources. I was able to share the full gospel with them, which was really exciting. They were very, very interested, and the the chap said to me, this is the first time I've ever had this presented where you tie in real history and real evidence with the message. So that was really encouraging. And, hopefully that'll lead them along to discovering the Saviour. And yesterday, and this is something that hopefully Diane will comment on, but I had a fella just pop into the museum and asked what we were about. I briefly told him, and he said, well, there's no way we've been created. Just look at the knees. They're terrible designs. Have you ever seen the design of a knee? And before I could say anything, he walked out. So I didn't really have much of a chance to respond to that, but perhaps Diane would like to comment on the design of the knees. But the thing I immediately thought of was, well, you still call them designs. Even if they're bad designs, they're designs. It's like, if you had ejector seats in a helicopter, you still wouldn't reject the fact that they were a designed machine.
Even if they didn't work properly.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I actually have one of our specimens here, Diane, that I know you've seen before when we did the Round the Museum with Diane and Joe series, which is still ongoing on our channel, by the way. But we've actually got our articulated leg, right, with the foot and the ankle down there, leading up to the knee in this area with the femur on the top. So while I've got this up here, so everybody can see it, and you can come and see our full skeleton, Ezekiel. But Diane, over to you. Do you want to comment very briefly on just the design of the knee?
Well, actually, the point Craig made was very good because people get arthritis, which is part of the sort of general degeneration of the world. We've tried to make artificial knees. In fact, I think anyone amongst the have an artificial knee. I think Glenn, you said you had one. Yes, well, I remember when they were still working on the design of that, and the first ones we made just didn't work because they didn't get all of the subtleties and the cleverness of the knee joint and all the curves and how it rotates properly. So it took a lot of effort and a lot of clever design to make an artificial knee. If anyone ever says any part of the body is badly designed, we'll think we can't make anything that's even a vague copy of this and get it to work. And that certainly applies to knees. It took a lot of really clever design to get something that works like a knee and is still not as good as a real one. The fact that we knock our knees around, well, that's not bad design. That's just the hardest working parts of a machine are the ones that tend to wear out. So if you make them work harder, well, they do tend to wear out.
I like the fact that the guy walked out of the museum. Sort of an interesting point. So, Glenn, when you walk into our museum, we'll make the same point about your artificial knees.
I just wish the doctors would also make it easier to replace that knee because it's brutal. It's just like going into someone's machine shop. They don't use the tools you would think a doctor would use. No, it's skill saws and big sledgehammers, it looks like.
Well, I looked out the window.
When I was studying, was the orthopedic surgeon got up and said, well, orthopedic surgery is basically carpentry.
That's it.
Hasn't changed since the Middle Ages, hey?
And I wish I would have just asked them, can I have my knee? Then I could compete with Joseph. I would have my actual knee there to show people.
Knee, yeah.
I was going to say this fellow walked out the museum. I looked out the window and he jumped on his motorbike, a big motorbike where knees are very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. Well, thanks for clearing that up, Diane. It's good to hear, Craig, that the museum certainly is impacting people, even if it's only just providing content to talk about on this show. But there we are. No, great stuff. Sam, how are you doing? Why don't you kick us off, Sam, after you've done the welcome? Why don't you kick us off with your sort of ministry report? Let us know what you've been doing in the last little while.
All right. Well, I've had a little bit of a hard time this week with my cat. He's been, unfortunately, had a blocked bladder, so he's been back at the vet. Third time it's happened. So fingers crossed and prayers that this is the last time. But yeah, busy working, busy trying to put my nose to the grindstone and that all that jazz. I've also been on Standing for Truth last week. If you missed that program, you can go on to Standing for Truth channel, and it was on Saturday last week. It's a great watch, gives you a nice sort of behind the scenes look at sort of the ministry, and it gives you a sort of an insight into the book that I'm writing. So do stay tuned to Creation Conversations for updates on that. But I thought, kicking off ministry report, obviously I've been doing the Bible Journey Challenge, and let me hear a whoop whoop or hashtag Bible Journey in the chat if you've been following along. But I put together a little sort of update video, sort of in the sort of Sam Classic cinematic style, which I uploaded a few days ago. I thought it would be good to show that here as sort of my ministry report. So I will key that up now, and so everyone enjoy. And there we go. So that is sorry?
That's looking real good, Sam.
Yeah.
Real good.
Thanks. So I just thought it'd be sort of like a nice thing to do to sort of just summarize sort of what has been covered in the Bible journey so far. If you guys enjoyed that sort of cinematic edit, then please let me know, and it might become a regular sort of update thing. I can do a cinematic sort of take of what the text has covered that sort of time, or if there's maybe going into sort of like the Leviticus or Deuteronomy, it might just be sort of better to have like a conversation about sort of some of the things covered. But yeah, it's going really well. I'm very pleased with the progress that I'm making. I'm very encouraged by it as well, and so thank you very much for your prayers and for continuing with the journey if you are doing it with me. And if you don't know, I am reading through the Bible from start to finish, from Genesis to Revelation in order, and I will be continuing on with that text this month. I'm already chugging my way through, so please do follow along if you are, and yeah, so I just thought it'd be something fun to do for everyone. I think it's a hit so far. I mean, the chat seemed to like it anyway.
Yeah. Great stuff. All right, John, how about your ministry report and Diane's as well, in terms of what you've been up to with the ministry and what the plans are going forward?
Okay, well, we've basically, as we said, shared before, we've done an incredible amount of work in a very short period of time with lots of fossils. And what I found interesting is one of the guys who needed to get into the building, who runs a church, I said to him, well, look, when you go into our room, the seminar room, it's full of fossils. He said, well, most churches are anyway. Sometimes a really sad truth. So tomorrow, Diane, we're down at Nerang, preaching in the churches. And then during the week, it's all the museum stuff, as well as preparing new content, basically for the museum. It's going to just take up our whole time, isn't it, in the next week or so?
There's lots of wonderful stuff to share. So
yeah, there certainly is. And we'll probably get one more evidence news out before the museum opening, you reckon?
Yes.
Just a short one?
Yes.
Yes.
Great stuff.
It's always
Grand
good to
stuff.
share good news with our
And
supporters.
any of you Aussie supporters out there who are watching in the early morning here in Australia, don't forget, if you want to come, you have to register for one simple reason. The only seminar room in our building at the moment holds 50 people. We're only going to aim at 40 because we've got fossils and everything all around the world. So if you want to come, you have to go to Info at Creation Research and tell us, right? There's a limited number of spaces. We've already used up many of them. So make sure you get in ASAP, as soon as possible, quickly as you can. Send us an email and say, me and 37 children are coming. We'll tell you there's no room for 33 of those kids. So anyway, we're looking forward to hearing from more of you. That's here in Australia, here in Queensland, because the new building is actually 5 minutes from an airport, and it's right beside three major motorways. We couldn't have said, Lord, pick us a better spot. It's wonderful. So thank you for those of you who prayed, and we'll look forward to seeing them Sunday week, won't we? Sunday afternoon at the museum.
That's Sunday week.
Yeah, Sunday week.
19th.
Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. Great stuff. Now, we're looking forward to it, and I wish I could be there, but yeah, it'd be good to come and see it at some point for sure. Anyway, Craig, you've got something to share with us as sort of part of a ministry report. So why don't you take us through that, and that can lead us nicely into our main topic for our birthday celebrations. So, Craig, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yeah, sorry, I think I cut in a little bit early with my ministry report before, but
that's
anyway, I just had a slide to show that might just kick off the conversation tonight regarding climate change. If you want to put that one up, Joe. This is a book that was written by Tim Flannery. So for those who don't know Tim Flannery, he is a very prominent Australian scientist. He's worked in universities, I think in the Australian Museum, certainly in museums around Australia. And he was even Australian of the Year back in 2007. And you can see the billboard that he's standing in front of, and you thought God made the weather. So if you don't think this whole climate change thing is a religious ideal, then think again. And in fact, the statement on the left there, right now, our fate is in our hands, for we are the weather makers. and we already possess the tools required to avoid catastrophic climate change. So it's putting man in control of even the weather, which the Bible is very clear that God's the one that's in control of the weather. And so really this is a real humanistic focused religion, and this guy is a leading proponent of it, at least in this country. You can come back to me if you like, Joe. I do just want to share another couple of comments that this Tim Flannery has made. He said that basically humankind is part of a superorganism. I'll just read a quote from him. He says, "Today we are on the edge of creating a global superorganism, and that will mean there will be no outside. There is no other." Right? A very religious statement, if you like, from the book of Tim Flannery. And an example of a superorganism basically is like ants. Okay, so ants operate as a whole, and they're sort of regarded as a type of superorganism. And I'll come to the significance of that in just a moment. But part of this quote is, he says, "This is tremendously important, this development, for the future of life on Earth, because for the first time, this global superorganism, this global intelligence will be able to send a single, strong, and clear signal to the Earth. And what that means is that we will be a regulating intelligence for the planet." And he says there are real implications for individuals living in a superorganism, right? And one of the golden rules of superorganisms is that as the superorganism becomes ever more competent as a whole, the individuals within it become less competent. So I read that as he's basically saying the superorganism is what's important and the individual is very unimportant. And that's very concerning, I think, for all of us. But that's basically where this climate cult and humanistic-based cult is heading. So that's a real positive thing to start the day on, isn't it?
Lovely.
Craig, if I can just add a picture here, Craig, if you want to take that down. This is where it all began with our creation research, and Tim Flannery stars in quite a few of our videos for one particular reason. Even back in 2006, 7, 8, 9, when this was sort of kicking off, he was notorious for getting it wrong. If he made a prediction about Sydney Harbour, the rain in our dams becoming just insignificant, it would never fill up again, he would score the Nobel Prize for incompetence. And from that day to this, I don't know how many predictions he's made based on his climate change, humanistic, holistic, one single organism model that he's got right. Do you, Diane? No, he's just bombed out every time. And yet the press still puts him up there, still elevates him. So again, if you want to check out what Craig has said, go and have a look at our DVDs. They're now available in streaming, all the climate change series, because they became some of our best sellers while video sort of reigned supreme. And there's a lot of other competition now, but in reality, they were incredibly successful because they simply told you the truth. Tim Flannery said this, here's what's happened. In fact, I'm reminded as we touch this subject, I would listen with delight to last night's weather forecast and thought, I wonder what will really happen, because from midnight to this morning, we were going to have 100 mils of rain, a huge amount of rain overnight. And so far we've had 1.6 mils in the 10 hours since we listened to the news forecasting that. So as Jesus said, you don't even know where the wind comes from or where it goes. And we certainly know the evidence that climate forecasts are notorious for actually getting it wrong.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good point. You see, part of what this whole topic or the amount of stuff that we've dealt with, because we've dealt with climate change more than any other topic in our sort of creation world, starting with, I think this is the first one they ever put out, climate change and creation, Climate Change, the God Factor, the most recent lecture, which is the God's Eye View of Climate and Change, and then our first on-location documentary about climate, right, starring me, John, and we're in the UK, in Iceland, and in Australia, looking at the history. So this is available to get, obviously, as a DVD from the Creation Research Store, but it's also available to stream on our streaming site, and it's available as an MP4 to download as well. So this is actually where Creation Conversation started 2 years ago. It was March 2 years ago, sort of, you know, in the tail end of well, we were still kind of in the middle of COVID, but sort of heading towards the other side. You could see the light in the far distance. And we just finished producing Fire and Ice. And we decided we ought to do some kind of a live stream to chat about it. And back then they were only sort of 30 minutes long. And it went so well, we decided to do it again. And we turned it into a weekly feature of sort of me and John having a chat. And then after a few weeks, couple of months, we started getting some guests on. And I think Diane joined us as a guest, and then she joined us as a permanent member of the team. And then later Sam came along, and later Craig, and even later Glenn. So this is where it all started, a discussion about climate change. So really, that's what we're going to be predominantly looking at tonight. We've kind of gone around and done our ministry updates and our news and stuff like that, but we're going to spend a little bit of time now talking about climate change. And although we have dealt with climate change a lot on Creation Conversations, we are going to be dealing with things that we have never dealt with before on Creation Conversations, or in fact actually something that we don't deal with in any of these productions. So it really shows you how much information there is out there about climate change within Creation Research. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand over to you, John, because I know you've got a rock for us to sort of hold up. And before we really delve into the whole topic of climate change, it's a good place to start with regards to evidence of climate change, but there's also something very special about this rock, something that's both special to you and to me. So why don't you take us away with that rock?
Okay. Now, the interesting thing is bringing rocks into the country can sometimes be fraught with legal issues, customs issues, angry customs officer who, well, just destroys your evidence. But this is absolutely unique. Now, Joe, you'll have to tell me how you see that, because I can't see
just how you're holding it. Just tilt it ever so slightly back. Yep, that's nice. I can see that nice and clearly now.
Now, Joe, you've actually been to Australia and seen this rock in person. What are you looking at as a bit of an expert?
Well, there's two very specific things on this rock. Number one, in the middle there, you can actually see a footprint, and you've got the little toes down there, yep, where you can see. But if you look to the right-hand side of the footprint, as we see it on our screens, you should just be able to start to see some little dimples. Looks like sort of the surface of the moon, little craters, right? Those are raindrop impressions. Now, this is a strange-looking footprint because it's not a dinosaur, is it, John?
No, it's certainly not a dinosaur. It's from the red beds of Texas. And that brings me to a bloke that you and I know, because you've worked at length with him. And we want to acknowledge his blessing to the ministry, because just under a week ago, he died. A Christian guy, no trouble with him going to be with the Lord. Dying is our problem, not death. If you're a Christian, we struggle to avoid a lengthy dying process. But I'm talking about Joe Taylor. Now, this is only one of the fossils that Joe personally dug up. In fact, it's one of the few ones I've got. He's actually autographed the back and explained what the fossil is and what the raindrops are. And there's two things. One is, if you find a fossil with raindrops on it, it only formed after rain came upon the earth. Now, Joe, as our resident English expert, you only ever get to talk about rain or snow over there. What does that tell you if you find a fossil with raindrops impressed on the rock?
Well, if you've got raindrops that are impressed solidly onto the rock, if you have raindrops, I mean, we get raindrops in mud and stuff all over the place, but then the next puddle comes along and it washes them away, right? Mud on itself doesn't preserve. You need to have rain, which is then buried very quickly with another layer of rock. So first and foremost, you have to have another wave, you have to have another tide, you have to have another something come over, but it can't just be water, because if it's just water, it's going to get rid of it. It's going to wash it away, right? Just like most tides do nowadays. That tide or current or water needs to be laden with sediment. It needs to be a slurry of sediment, so that at the base of this tidal wave, whatever it is, you are actually burying what's underneath it, including this footprint and including this raindrop. So you've got this creature that is walking along, it's obviously chucking it down with rain, and the sediment is soft. You see, this is a sort of muddy sediment, but this is in the middle of a huge, great big, thick mega sequence, right? Huge, great big, thick bed. So you've got this creature walking along, and it's raining, it's stormy, but then before it has chance to get that footprint destroyed, before you have chance to wash away those raindrops, it's actually been buried by another slurry of sediment. So all your things are kind of matching this up to be a flooding event, really, isn't it, John?
Mm-hmm. Well, let me just hold it up again for those folks who didn't catch on the first time. Now, how am I doing, Joe? You can see it
Pretty
on the
good,
screen.
yeah, I can see it nicely. Yeah.
Okay, and you can see all the little dimples. The footprint is there because the red mud, which is in multitudinous layers, right? Layer after layer, all the same stuff. And this was soft enough for this creature to almost swim through the slurry as the rain is coming down on the creature. And that gives you an earliest possible date, because the Bible says in Genesis chapter 2, and it did not rain, right? And the first rain is recorded at Noah's flood. Now, as unpopular as that is out in the world, because Noah's flood is not just, hey, God, why are you sending us rain? God had already warned them he was going to destroy the world with a flood, and this was the first rain, right? So we have on that rock evidence that it was raining. And in fact, when you look at the preservation being so beautiful and obviously so rapid, don't be surprised. Joe Taylor said, I think this is from Noah's flood, because these red beds are not just in Texas. They are enormous all the way through to Russia, right? These are global beds, global evidence of rain, global evidence of creatures being buried quick enough. Of course, that brings up two things that both Joe and I want to mention about Joe Taylor. He basically was self-taught. He was really an artist. In fact, he was one of those artists who designed posters for musicians. He came out of the Jesus movement. So he knew all about people like, the pianist who's very pro-gay. Well, he knew him. Elton John. Yeah. He knew him when he was actually married to a woman. Now, you can do with that what you like, but in reality, Joe is one of these guys who's mixed and matched his artwork with a very long career, which eventually involved becoming a casting expert for universities and things like that, with massive big casts of mammoth footprints, as well as going and digging up fossils himself. Very underappreciated, very much rejected because his arty ideas didn't fit with even some of the creationists, right? But we love Joe because his heart was in the right place. And what's interesting about that fossil, Joe was actually needing to raise funds for his little museum down there in Texas. And we offered to buy some of the things which we didn't have that we knew he'd found. And you know, the funny thing, we found it was cheaper to actually fly Joe to Australia with the fossils and luggage than it was to pack them up and post them and make sure they were security measured and everything was fumigated and all the things. So we ended up having Joe out here for quite a while, and it was a wonderful time. Joe with his big beard. I don't know if you have beards in heaven, but anyway, he's getting a new body up there. He's with the Lord. And Joe, what have you got to be thankful to Joe Taylor for?
Yeah, well, that's when I'd been following Joe's work for a long while, and it was when he came out to Australia that I first met him. So he was out for about a week. I'd been in Australia at that point for a couple of months by that time. We'd gone all the way down, hadn't we, John, and all the way around and back and to the middle and everywhere. And he actually joined us for my last week and a half in Australia before he got sent back. And so I basically became Joe's chauffeur for the week. We were staying with the same family up near Gympie, and so I'd drive him around, and we had our big open day, and he brought this fabulous Metoposaur skull, giant salamander skull, right, which we helped him to glue back together once it had arrived and fit it back into a display case and everything, and it was absolutely wonderful. And I got to chat with him for quite a while, and he actually invited me out to the States at that point to do some work with him. And so come a couple of years later, it was January 2020, so just before COVID, I flew over to Texas, and I spent 3 months with Joe from January to March, spending time in his museum, working with him, and basically learning from him, because yes, he had some interesting ideas, as John has mentioned, but he is a world-class artist. He's a world-class caster and a world-class fossil preparator, and a really truly godly man as well. So we had some wonderful time with him out there that I spent, and got to meet his family out there, and got to meet some of his kids, because he adopted a lot of kids. He really had a heart for looking after the lost and the orphans, right? And we got to spend a lot of time out there with his wonderful little community out in Cosberton in Texas. And so we got a lot of skills out of that for creation research, which I will be always grateful for, both in knowing how to cast fossils, how to cast things to make replicas, but you can also, use them in ways that you can't use the original, as well as learning how to glue and fix stuff back together. We then drove out all the way across Texas, all the way across New Mexico into Arizona, and actually ended up picking up a giant mammoth, which we brought back and started gluing and sorting back together again. So there's plenty of experience. And I just want to hold up one particular thing. This is actually a cast of one of the elongated Peruvian skulls that Joe a few years back actually went and cast the original. And what you do when you cast the original, when you make a cast of that mold, you always keep that first cast because it's the best thing you've got, or the closest thing you've got to the actual thing, right? And his mold had started falling apart, so he actually had to recast the original mold that he had made, and this is the first one that we took from it. And so this is actually about as close to the real thing as you can get, the real skull that was molded. And this is one that I've got hundreds of hours of footage that we filmed of actually doing this, and got to make a cast of it and actually bring it back here to the UK. So we also brought other stuff back with us from Joe's collection, just like John has mentioned, and I will always be grateful to this great man for the skills that he imparted to me, and I look forward to seeing him again one day in the new heavens and the new earth.
Well, that sounds great. Where do you want to go next, Joe?
Well, why don't we dive into our main topic by going over to Diane, because this is our birthday celebrations. And so why don't we have a little bit of a look into the past at some of our greatest hits with regards to climate before we move into a brand new topic that you're going to bring us, John. So Diane, over to you.
Yes, these are some of our reports from our newsletter on climate change issues over the past year or so. So if we can go to the first slide here.
Joe can bring that up.
Yeah, that should. Oh, hang on, where are we? There we are.
There we are.
Yes, there we are.
It's all up and ready to go.
Yes, thank you. Yes, this was a story relating to climate that we reported on about broiler bears. Well, what's a broiler bear? Well, it turns out this is not working, is it?
Try that then.
You want to bring your actual slides up?
No, hang on. We've got to go to the.
Why don't we have that?
You need to go to the actual PowerPoint presentation.
Go to the PowerPoint. That's
There you
it.
go. You're there now. Yeah.
There we are. Right. Broiler bears. Well, you've all heard of brown bears, and you've all heard of polar bears. So if you put those two words together, you get broiler bear. And in fact, they are a hybrid of brown bears and polar bears, which are normally white, and they can interbreed. And we've known this for a very long time. because it has happened in zoos and it's also happened occasionally out in the wild. And the hybrids are a light brown or they're a patchy brown, and there have been reports of these sort of over the decades. Now, the link to climate is that the ranges, in other words, where these bears live, don't completely overlap. Polar bears tend to live right up towards the poles, sort of along the coastline. That's why their species name versus maritimus. They live on the coast. Brown bears, a little bit further south, but still in the fairly high latitudes, and their ranges do normally overlap, so they do occasionally meet in the wild. And this was a story that was reported last year. Polar bear numbers are already expected to plummet as the sea ice melts, but experts are now worried that any remaining individuals will see their genetics diluted by hybridization. So they do admit that they can hybridize, and what's more, they can actually produce fertile offspring. So they will go on breeding after the hybridization. And this was the story that we reported. Some studies estimate polar bears could be close to extinction by 2100, save for a few lonely subpopulations in the highest reaches of the Arctic. And if enough of them interbreed with brown bears, the pure species could disappear even sooner. Now, why is that a problem? Well, it's not really a problem, is it? After all, they are all one kind. They are Ursus. It's a good illustration of how one species is not necessarily one kind. One kind can be divided up into a whole lot of species, and the individual species might not breed simply because they don't have the opportunity. But now with the ranges of them extending because the climate is changing, because the environment's changing, they do meet up. And so we should just let bears be bears. They are all one kind. But any excuse to make a climate alarmist story these days. Now, this is the sort of records or the sort of headlines that we get to keep the fear going. How often do you see it's the wettest year, it's the hottest year, it's the driest year? Occasionally they'll mention it might be the coldest year, like it might be over in the UK where it's snowing in March. This was a story from last year. It was the wettest year. And this was a satellite picture produced by NASA Earth Observatory. Wonderful photos that they have on this. It's an interesting website to go and look at occasionally. This is the sort of southeastern quarter of mainland Australia. So it's Victoria down the bottom, New South Wales covering most of that picture, going up into the sort of South Queensland, showing all of the rivers or the main rivers in New South Wales and the New South Wales Victorian border, which is actually a river for most of its length. It's the Murray River, and how much they had expanded because we've had so much rain all along the eastern seaboard of Australia. And so it made a very vivid satellite picture. And so it was reported, this is the wettest year that we've had for such a long time. Well, how long is a long time? Well, this was a report in the ABC News. That's the Australian equivalent of the BBC. There was a period from about 1949 to about 1956 in which, well, pretty well every river in New South Wales had a genuinely big flood. And some of them had records which haven't been beaten since. So it's the wettest year since when? Now, this is an interesting photo that was provided for us by Glenn. Thank you very much. It's about the Burdekin River. Now, before anyone who knows Australian geography jumps in and says, well, the Burdekin River is not in New South Wales. No, it's not. However, it does make the same point. What they've done in the town here is that they have recorded the levels of floods over the past century or so, and it's a bit hard to see them, so I've split up that photo and put them side by side. Now notice when the highest one was 1972, but in there you'll see various various years going back, 1945, 1940, 1918. So we're not exactly going back a long time. It goes up and down all the time. So when you see those records in the headlines, the hottest year, the wettest year, the coldest year, the driest year since records began, always ask, well, when did the records begin? And sometimes it's only within a century. And anything in Australia in terms of these kinds of records only goes back to 1788. So it's not exactly the whole history of the earth. Now, here was another scare story about penguins, because everyone loves penguins. And, wouldn't it be a shame if the penguins were being decimated by climate change or something terrible was happening? So penguins were going south. This was a story in National Geographic. Gentoo penguins, they're waddling farther south into areas that were once too icy for them. But the population of chinstrap penguins, that's another species of penguins, and the sleek black-headed Adelie penguins, which depend on the sea ice, are declining. So penguins are going south and they're declining. Always good idea to go and check facts, just like Craig said about Tim Flannery. Go back and check things. Now, how far south can you go? These two species of penguins live in Antarctica, and Antarctica is as south as you can go before you fall off the bottom of the world. And Adelie penguins, if you go to the Australian Antarctic Commission, and they have web pages there about individual penguins, very interesting. Adelie penguins, conservation status, least concerned. In other words, they're doing fine. Chinstrap penguins, an abundant penguin species in the Antarctic and subantarctic regions, conservation status, least concern. They're doing fine as well. So anything to get people's interest and generate a bit of fear and concern. Now, we also have to remember that penguins live in all sorts of places. Now, here is a nice tropical looking scene. Any idea where these penguins live? On the Galapagos Islands, almost on the equator. Penguins live all over the southern hemisphere. Now, a lot of them do live down in the southern regions, which are the colder regions, but they live on the coast. So as long as they can find coastal areas to live on, whether it be on the edge of Antarctica or the southern parts of South America, South Africa, and Australia and New Zealand, there's plenty of habitats for penguins, and they're doing very well, thank you very much. So penguins can now live in Antarctica because they have certain features, but they were created for the good world, so they can live in warm spots as well as cool spots. They are now surviving in the fallen world. Good example of how the world has gone from good to bad to worse, and penguins are coping with that very well. And so let's
come back to us, Joe.
Come back to us now. And if anyone else would like to make some comments about the hottest, wettest, driest, whatever that the experts keep telling us about.
Where's our
Chrome down on the bottom?
So if you just click on your Windows key and then click on your browser, that should bring you back to us. And that's great stuff from there, Diane. I've got a couple of things to just show before we perhaps do a few questions that have come in, and before we move on to another one of our main topics, because we've covered quite a bit so far. I just wanted to share one or two quick little things, if I can get my browser to work. There we go. Right. I saw this the other day on BBC Earth, as you can see, a climate dictionary. Do you find language around climate change confusing? Swipe right for some definitions. Well, their first definition is what climate change actually is. So have a look at what they say. They say long-term shifts in our planet's temperature and weather patterns. Now, that's fine, right? That's something that we can find evidence for. That's something that we can make records of. That's something that we can observe, right? Shifts in our planet's temperature and weather patterns. So weather is different from climate, and we're looking for shifts in temperature and weather patterns. Then they go on to state this: predominantly caused by human activities and the emission of greenhouse gases. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. What do they define greenhouse gases as? Gases released from human activities that trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere, warming our planet. Well, already you're at a problem, because the main or the worst greenhouse gas, right, the one that is most effective, the one that produces the biggest effect, if you like, is water vapor, water in itself. And so immediately, well, where's your water come from? Well, the Earth is covered in water, right? It's got tons of the stuff, and the evaporation doesn't come from human activity, it comes from the sun. So immediately you're at odds with what this is producing, these greenhouse gases. Climate anxiety, the feeling of worry surrounding the threats of climate change. Lots of these definitions that they carried on with, like climate optimism and so on and so forth. But if we come back to their definition of climate change, you can notice it's actually split into two pieces. Long-term shifts in our planet's temperatures and weather patterns caused by human activities and the emission of greenhouse gases. Well, we've already discussed so far today the fact that there is a long history of climate change on Earth's planet. Everything from, even if you want to span out the geological history into millions of years, Earth, the story of Earth's climate is it's been going up, it's been going down, it's been going up and down and up and down. And we looked at some of that evidence in the geological record that John had. And if you look at, if you get Fire and Ice and have a watch of that, one of the things that we do is not just in Iceland, but also in the UK and in Australia, we look at the geological history, we look at the sedimentology history, the soils and stuff, and we also look at human history records. And you can trace the fact that climate has gone up and down and up and down and up and down all throughout history, way before, even by creationist and secular standards, humans were supposed to have anything to do with climate change. So why don't we, before we have a break for some questions, just go over to Glenn, because I know you had a few comments that you wanted to make, in particular about one guy who spoke up about climate change and really paid quite dearly for it. So Glenn, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm a soil physicist, and in the time of my career, the top soil physicist in the world was Don Nielsen. And after he retired, Don was president of Soil Science Society, just well known. After he retired, he contributed to this book. He's the second author on this, Facts About Global Warming. Let me read you just some of the quotes, if y'all have just a little bit of patience with me. He gives a statement that is an official statement on climate change, and then he gives his response. And so the first one is: the change of climate would cause the decline and termination of our civilization. He says the exact opposite of true is true. The increase of carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere causes the global warming, and vice versa. He says it's generally not valid. The rise or decrease of global temperature on a geologic scale depends on many factors. Here's one: the contemporary high concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide is no parallel in history. He just goes on to say that's just not true. The increase of carbon dioxide atmospheric concentration beyond a certain limit will lead to the extinction of many living genera. Not true. Mass extinctions never occurred due to high CO2. This just goes on and on. And let's say the contemporary global temperature is higher than it's ever been during the entire Holocene. Well, he says this declaration is not right. It just goes on and on and on. Well, the result of this was he was just really shunned by our society and by society, the soil scientists following up on this. Many of them talked about how they were just embarrassed by this, for his just taking a stand. And what he did was he went through and tracked the data and showed that these carbon dioxide levels, these greenhouse gases, have fluctuated and have been high in the past. Now, this guy was not a creationist, and he certainly, didn't profess any beliefs in creation, yet he just stuck to the science. And as he said, there were so many other factors that control the temperature that the greenhouse gases just play a minor role.
Glenn, two things, or three things actually. You have a lady beside you, and none of us know who it is except the inner circle. You better introduce her.
This is a fellow fossil digger expert. This is my wife, Ruby, and she goes with me everywhere. Just ask John and Diane, because when we went to Australia, she was out there digging fossils with both of them. And certainly Joseph has had some enjoyable time with her. I don't know. Yeah, you went with us when you and I and Joseph and John went and
Yeah. We went fossil hunting around Tennessee. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you for that, Glenn. Secondly, there's two things here that are relevant. One is I know farmers who've run with the truth of what that book is that you're quoting from and done the experiments in their field. Practically, one farmer said to me, I pump my exhaust through my seed plow and pump the CO2 into the ground. And he says the germination rate has increased incredibly, right? He said, by putting CO2 first into the soil, my seeds respond magnificently. So there's a positive evidence that CO2 does not hinder the plants. It actually helps them. And secondly, at Creation Research, we ran 5 or 6 years of experiments on actually having terrariums, breeding small plants, and then having terrariums so you had normal CO2, then double, then triple, then quadruple. And what we discovered was somewhere between 3 times and 4 times the normal amount of CO2. We got maximum yield, not minimum yield. But you know what killed our experiment? Climate change, global warming, because the shed we were doing it in burnt down.
Well, let me read one more quote just along those lines. He says, the increase of atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration and the consequent global warming will cause famines. An incorrect statement, he says. The increase of CO2 air concentration has an effect identical to fertilization. So one of the things you can look and see, I've got publications on global warming impacts on crop productivity. And basically, it will shift the growing season, but it's not detrimental to them. And it's well known that this increased CO2, it's like they said, it's like a fertilization. It will increase productivity. But that's not what we're hearing or what's being promoted.
Yeah. And Glenn, this guy's shunning by the fellow scientists and the society is exactly what happened to Professor Peter Ridd that John had mentioned earlier. He's been kicked out, and I've actually got a quote that he said on a national TV here late last year. He said, the scientific system is much like the mafia. If you step out of line, you get your kneecaps kicked in or you get a horse head thrown in your bed. That's just the way it works. And so that was his view of the scientific system. And I guess that's what we find all the time as people that believe in creation. You know, you get the horse head thrown in your bed for raising the fact that God might have just created the world.
In fact, Glenn, when you came out here, one of your things was to do a conference in Townsville, and it involved someone who reported on the then effect of climate on the reef. Would you like to briefly say, before we go to our first Q&A, what you learned during that week?
Yeah, we took a day off before we came back to see you, and we took an excursion to go out to the Great Barrier Reef. Actually, we took 2. But the whole justification for the conference there in Townsville was for the impact of soil erosion on the reef. And when we went just right off the coast there, you could see the sediment. It was impacting the reef right there. But we took an excursion and went out 2-hour boat ride way out on the Great Barrier Reef. It was a great experience. We got to scuba dive for the first time.
Yeah.
Found out we'll stick to snorkeling. But the cruise had to have a marine biologist on it to speak to us about the Great Barrier Reef. And it was a young man who said that, he grew up scuba diving on the reef since the oldest that he can remember. His parents were really into that. And then that inspired him to go on and get his degree in marine biology. And he said he has seen no impact of global warming or all the trash that we're being told that the soda straws are killing the reef. He said he's never seen them out there on the Great Barrier Reef. But he said that the reef is a living, growing organism, and it has periods of growth and periods of decay and places of growth and periods of decay. It's just the normal cycle. And in fact, while we were there, the water was just milky white with just it just reproducing so rapidly with I guess it's the sperm in the waters. And he just said this reef is just healthy, and he has seen no trends of deterioration despite all the reports that we've heard.
Yeah. If you ever want a fascinating story or history, look up coral and reef reproduction. It's mind-boggling, the complexity that goes into it. It really is. They did a very good, I think it was a David Attenborough presentation, which of course you have to take some of the commentary with a pinch of salt, but the footage is stunning, and it's mind-blowing, the complexity of some of this stuff. But anyway, go John.
Just thinking about Professor Peter Ridd, because he was the professor at Townsville and basically lost his job for taking a stand, simply saying there is nothing wrong with the reef. It is doing well, thank you. I've been the professor here for X years. I've been out there every year multiple times, and there is nothing wrong. And it cost him his job.
We've written a bit about that on in the fact file. If you look up Barrier Reef, you'll find some information about him and more about the Barrier Reef in general as well.
Right, Joe,
I think he was actually the Dean of Science.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, great stuff. All right. Well, Sam, if you're here with us, because I know you had to pop in and out every so often, if we can run down through some questions before we move on to our other topic, which we've never covered before on Creation Conversations, which is, of course, John dealing with sea level change. So let's have a couple of questions for the team from the chat so far.
All righty. Well, we've got some thanks to go out first. We've got Doki Doki coming in swinging even before the live stream began with 149 US buckaroos, a slice of pink birthday cake with purple icing and a candle. Thank you very much, Doki. And also as well, Doki Doki coming in again with 5 US buckaroos, a pair character cheerfully blowing a party horn. See, it's all a party this week. It's our second anniversary. I love it. And super sticker from Jim P, 199 Aussie buckaroos, a slice of pink birthday cake with purple icing and candle. See, giving cake out left, right, and centre. I've had mine, so I'll share over with the other people. And I believe we've had some. Do we have any others in terms of thanks? I'm not sure if we did. Just doing a quick double check, and I don't think so. Yep, no, that's it. So we will move on to our first question. This comes in from Doki Doki. Question: how's the Stylotype machine coming along?
Well,
you use Stylotype machines. You go ahead, Joseph and Craig.
Yeah, well, in the UK, it's coming along very nicely. We're getting close to. We're about a month and a half in, and we're already getting closer to the 2-inch mark. So we're keeping up with the rest of the experiments, which seem to be on an average of about 1 inch per month, which is wonderful. Something I noticed rather interesting is that for the first kind of 4 weeks, when we filled it up with water, it was dripping down right through the container, down through the wicks, and onto the the base below. We were basically having about a watering can and a half of flow through as it was dripping down, right? And the stalactite was definitely there and it was definitely growing, but it took a few weeks before you could actually say, hey, there's a stalactite, right? You could kind of see the crystals there and certainly the buildup on the stalagmite. What we've now found in the last week is that the water rate, the dripping rate, has slowed down. We're now getting barely half a can a day, sometimes even less, actually come dripping down through the stalactite. But the stalactite is now growing at a much, much, much faster rate. So back up to that kind of 1 inch per month kind of thing. So it's interesting. We're now at the point where we've got a nice calcium carbonate build up on the base, right, the drip plate. So you're effectively getting little stalagmites start to build up. And now we can begin to do things like introduce some leaves to it. We can introduce a little ball of yarn to see if we can permineralize it, a mini teddy bear, stuff like that. So we'll be doing that in the next couple of weeks. But we're also pulling together a little video sort of documenting the whole process about the building of the machine and so on and so forth. So be watching for that coming shortly.
Craig, how's yours getting on?
Yeah, Joe's showing off a little bit, but ours is going pretty good. Not a stalactite, okay? Not the one coming down. We got the drip going a little bit too. Maybe we're all drips down here. Ah, there you go. But we have a stalagmite forming, a big one. It's after what we've been going about 2 years on it. We've got a stalagmite that's about probably over 2 inches high, but it's also about probably 1.5 inches thick. So it's quite a substantial stalagmite, but our stalactites a little bit poor.
Yeah.
Sadly.
Well, I'll make a recommendation, and remember, one of the things that's come out of this research is the fact that it's bacteria that actually helps the lime precipitate. So if you're looking for the sort of bacteria you find in caves that actually make stalactites, despite the denial of biological processes where people think it's just the calcite dissolving, precipitating, etc. If you want to find out the right bacteria, you've got a mouthful of them. So actually take your mouth water after you've brushed your teeth, leave your teeth dirty for a week, and then spit into your stalactite machine, and you get just the right bacteria because you deposit plaque on your teeth, and that's calcite.
Yeah.
That's disgusting, John.
It's one of the requirements for our museum. Everybody who comes in has to swill their mouth out and spit it into.
John, you didn't tell Ruby and I that before we saw your machine and was touching it and picturing it.
We didn't know what you were really like then. We didn't want to offend you.
But it is that organic element is something that's very important. We found that we filled up probably about a good third of the basin with organic material, which rotted down over the next few days, or started to compress down, and so we keep topping it up. But it really is that key principle. So yeah, it's coming along nicely. Thanks for asking, Doki.
Yep. Joe, while you're mentioning it, I didn't really give an update progress report, but one thing you mentioned was the permanentization, and we went out looking for fossils this week at a place that a member at our church told us about, and what we actually found was a roadside cliff that is just being coated. It's with ironstone from just the iron-rich and manganese-rich mineral waters that are seeping out of the rock. So we plan on putting out some different objects to see how long it would take for them to permanentalize.
Perfect. Yeah. And Lord willing, I was just chatting to John about this the other day, but Lord willing, I'll be coming out to the States at some point later this year, middle of this year. So do continue to pray for that. And if you're in the States around June time, do get in touch with Glenn or Creation Research, because Lord willing, I'll be out there at some point. So we'll keep you updated about that. How about another question, Sam, before we move on to our main topic?
All right. Well, I've got to give a quick thanks to Neil. He's coming with 10 British
Absolutely.
buckaroos. So God bless you, mate. Thank you so much. I've got a question here, which is it's quite interesting, actually, because I've heard this sort of being kicked about the sort of the circuit in terms of an argument. Neil has asked, so methane and cows with wind don't affect climate change? I thought they said it does.
You will find that it is commonly believed that cow air being expelled at one end or the other has a big effect on climate change. We've investigated this thoroughly, and you will find that the methane gas does not go out both ends in the same quantity. I mean, even you breathe out methane at the wrong end, and some foolish high school boys will set their exhaled bottom air on fire just to prove this. But with cows, methane is largely from the front, Diane, isn't it? From their digestion. And what have we found about methane and climate?
Well, it's part of their fermentation process. So a cow just has this vast fermentation vat before it goes to its true stomach, where the rest of the digestion happens. So they tend to burp methane. But yes, they do produce methane. There's no doubt about that. But methane is a natural gas that's part of the normal environment, and there are bacteria in the soil which will break it down. So methane just circulates within the environment between the air and the soil and the water as part of a natural process. It's only a problem where you try and have too many cows in the all together in one place in unnatural conditions. If you leave them out in the fields and feed them on grass, it's not a problem at all. We actually have a question on this on the Ask John Mackay site. If you go to our Ask site and just look up cows, because a high school student wrote in and said, why did God invent cows when they produce dangerous gases? So we did answer that question, and you'll find a bit more about methane in that. So yes, methane is there, but it's not a problem in the sort of natural environment that God invented, with the gas being reabsorbed and broken down by the bacteria that are out in the environment.
So God thought of the solution before we thought of the problem.
Yeah. And we caused the problem in the first place. So that's the thing.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Well, it's probably good that we move on, and we'll come back to questions. We'll be having a question answer broadcast in the next couple of weeks anyway, so keep your questions coming. But I'm quite excited about this because this is a topic which I sort of heard a lot about, but it was in 2019, John, when we were traveling together in the UK, that this topic, it was really big. I mean, climate change has always been a big topic, no matter sort of for the last 20 years. But this is something that had come up in particular because at the time there was a little island, or is a little island called Tuvalu, which had been arguing that the British ought to pay them compensation because the British Empire introduced industrialization, and it's industrialization which has caused climate change, and the climate change has caused sea level rise, and Tuvalu is now being overwhelmed by the sea and it's sinking and drowning, and we ought to pay them compensation for it. Right? It would hit the newspapers and the media. This was back in sort of 2018, 2019. But this whole topic of sea level rise, sea level change, the Earth is warming up, climate change, global warming, the glaciers are melting, the ice caps are melting, and it's going to come and flood. And I remember visiting places like Dunwich on the Norfolk coast, or I think it's technically the Suffolk coast, better get that right, and they were saying that it would be gone in a few years' time, and it's still there today. And I remember when my mum visited Dunwich as part of a school trip, they told her that Norwich would be a seaside town by the year 2010. Well, 2010 has come and passed, and Norwich is still British in British terms, nowhere near the sea. Anyway, over to you, John, because I think this will be a fascinating study.
I bought a few show and tell items because, as you've heard from Glenn, he's been there, Barrier Reef, heard from the locals what they've actually observed, as opposed to the politicians like Tim Flannery, who simply tell you what they want to be policy. And inevitably, if you check the facts, it turns out to be wrong. So to give you a bit of our overview, I couldn't recommend more highly a book on the history of Australia, particularly from someone related to one of our acting families today. Old King Kidman, he actually made a fortune out of climate and climate change in particular, which was a real shock to the British who came to Australia, because you've got England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales, and you can drive the length in a day. And in fact, I've actually been with families and I've asked them, what's the weather going to be like when I get to the other side? Well, it's only 50 miles away. You can see it. So no wonder the British got so good at weather forecasting. As I said, put their binoculars on out of the highest tower. Weather is an integral part of basically the whole British Isles, with a few bits of modification north, south, east and west. But in Australia, you have a mega continent by comparison, a mega space of land. And when you came to Australia and you measured the climate, the temperature that was measured way down on the beaches when they first set up the tent colonies in the 1800s, and they were shocked by how hot it could be down the bottom, right? But closest to the poles, they couldn't believe the high temperatures they recorded. And basically what's happened is, because those temperatures were done by ignorant sailors, they are not regarded as official. Now, I have to remind people, those ignorant sailors depended on their thermometers to actually plot their courses, because that's what made England a great maritime nation, a great clock and an accurate thermometer, right? Those two things, England without them wouldn't have been a great maritime power. So when they first came to Australia, climate recognition was a shock to them. And for Kidman, he made a fortune out of it, because he noticed, because he had cattle and drovers basically everywhere, for one simple reason. He'd noticed if it was great weather in Adelaide, in South Australia, I mean, that's why they settled there. The weather was great. It was green right up to where the current border of South Australian Northern Territory is. And then he noticed that basically, if it dried out in South Australia, it was now wet in the Northern Territory, that area, right? If it dried out in the west, it was now wet in the east. And there was a band which moved across Australia. And if you wanted your cattle to be fat and you wanted to be wealthy, you moved your cattle with the weather. You couldn't build fences like you did in England and say, this is my country, and hope the weather would do just the right thing. No, he went with the weather. And one of the things we do is check the actual history. Get the reports of the sailors who built their tent colonies on the beach in the southern part of Australia. Actually, one of the other things we do is, from the time I've been a kid, I've loved the beach and I love collecting shells. Now, we've used this shell here in a different context. I'll bring it up close. This one here is called an Arca shell. It was named after the 16th century view of Noah's Ark. It was named by the guy who invented the classification system, and it gives you an idea of how much Christianity has impacted both people's ability to name things, and they named it out of a familiarity, a big ark shape with a little cabin on the top, and they named it because God invented things, and therefore evolution wasn't true, so you could run with a species and genus concept and expect it to work. That's why the ancient Greeks couldn't get their naming systems to work. Now, basically, when you look at this, I was told by one of our professors at Queensland University that if you go along the beach down near Sandgate, you'll find the deposit of these Arca shells. Now, I was a student a long time ago now, pre-climate change, right? But in order to find this deposit, you needed to know where the water came to high tide. Now, in the last 40 years, in the last 50 years, since I first went to this beach 65 years ago, now that's a long time span compared to many of the current professors. You know, it's interesting. The sea level has reached its maximum at about exactly the same spot it is now. Now, one of the things we loved to do was wander along the beach at a place called Wynnum, which is an Aboriginal word meaning breadfruit. You know, the tropical, well, you probably don't know the tropical big fruits, but they can be made into a flour, cooked, etc. And so the British called them a breadfruit. but the Aboriginal word is Wynnum. And the one thing we loved going to was in January and December, when you get really high tides, you'd have to race the tides that came up over the seawall and backed up into the streets. Now, it is still doing that, and it still reaches roughly the same level where we could run to when we were kids. The sea level has, from personal observation, over decades. I mean, look how old I'm getting, living fossil, dinosaur grandpa, etc. The sea level has basically been the same. But of course, in places like Tuvalu and the ancient maps you dig up from the British Empire, when you check them, yes, you can check them, because if there's one thing the British were absolutely emphatic on, was if you're a captain, if you're an admiral, you will record this. You will take the temperature, you'll measure the time, you'll give us the location, and we can go back and check. It was absolutely vital to maritime dominance of the entire globe. So one of the things we know is on the British maps that are stored in the Admiralty that you can go and check, it will say this island has disappeared. It was there in this year, it was gone in the following 5 years. So all of those things are on our fact file. They're all on our evidence news, etc. I'd encourage you, go and check sea levels. Go and check, the Arca Shelf. Go and check even Kidman, who gets a favourable mention because he was only interested in making money from cows. So he simply recorded where the cows went. And it makes a great book, by the way. Thanks to Jill Bowen for doing a revised edition after 20 years since the first one. So a really good read, and you'll appreciate it. Up to date, read the climate. Diane, what is this?
That's a fruit.
Do you know what sort of fruit? We had some last night. We chopped it up. You get lots of seeds out of it.
Passion fruit.
It's called a passion fruit, yes, mainly because of the flower and the cross in the middle related to the passion of Christ. Oh, have I mentioned the influence of Christianity on classification? Passiflora, the passion flower. Okay, so if you get up close, I hope you can see. Can you see the bad spots on it? We've had an interesting climate year. It hasn't affected the sea level per se. Oh, you get minor changes when it floods down and you get the sediment which runs out and covers up reefs close to the shore. But the sea level basically remains the same in my lifespan. In places you can track over a couple of 100 years, islands disappear, not because the sea level rose, but because the islands sank due to subsidence and earthquakes. But when you get a funny year with weather, you remember I was talking about that band that moves up and down Australia? Even I knew that when that weather band shifted, you could end up with a dry part in the south and floods up north. If it came halfway down, you get floods in New South Wales, not Queensland. Occasionally, you would find it moving. Well, it did here in 2010, etc. It actually went all the way down to Tasmania, and even Craig is old enough to remember the floods that happened in that year as that band covered the whole of Australia. But this year, it's done wrong. We don't know why it's doing this, but we've had wet at really a lot and at the wrong times. So this is one of about 10 passion fruit I've got from my vine, which is usually laden. Now, I suspect it's bumped off or the bees, the fertilizers have gone somewhere else, but I have a minimal crop and the bugs are actually eating into the skin, trying to get some food themselves. And the other effect, my wife loves bananas. No, not evidence she came from monkeys, but evidence we grow them because they're cheaper to grow and they grow beautifully here in Australia, but not this year. You see, where I am, the native food has not responded to the weather. The sea level hasn't changed. If they ate seaweed, they'd still be right. And you can eat seaweed, by the way, you do in ice cream. We have sea grapes and that. You can live off the beach just from the food you pick up. But in reality, the birds are eating the bananas absolutely green. Normally, we have to worry about the bats coming along when they're just getting ripe. Not a problem, bats. This year, the fruit's already gone, chewed to pieces by the parrots. So that's the basic background. We encourage people, get out there and make the observations yourself. Now, basically, if you'll take me back to the screen show now, Joe, we'll run you through some of the sea level things and factors that are affecting here. All right. Now, what do we need to do to get this going, Diane?
Yeah, PowerPoint.
There we are. PowerPoint we have there. Right.
Yeah.
That's it. All right. Now, this is where we started years ago, and we still do. Tomorrow when I preach, I will bring this up to the church. 1 Thessalonians 5:21. The Bible says to test everything, to prove all things, only keep those things which are true. Interesting theme for a scientist or a weather checker. Okay, nearby my house, a new motorway went in, and look what they found alongside the river. By the way, it's bumped up the value of my property from a couple of $100 an acre. I won't tell you what it is now. It keeps changing because the dollar's dropping, etc. But as they put this road in, they found crocodile fossils. Now, the important part, over at Geebung, you'll find crocodile bones in the material they had to dig out along the riverbank. Now, there's roughly where Geebung is, Aboriginal name, of course, and there's the same sort of crocodile deposits up on the Darling Downs, 120, 130 kilometres inland, much more elevated. But if you know the right places to go, you'll find crocodile remains everywhere between the Darling Downs and the coast. The interesting part about that, there's a crocodile. We've got plenty of them in Australia. They like it being warm. Their eggs, the sex of the eggs is determined by the climate. So they can't sort of afford too much cold or too much heat. They will die out. See that line at the top? That's roughly a bit north of Bundaberg. And the crocodiles become a problem, both for fishing. Yes, I've caught crocodiles on the end of the line, and there's no way you're going to reel them in. They are just so powerful. A flick of the tail and your line and sinker, etc., goes with them. But you see the bottom line? That's the lowest case we find of where the fossil crocs are. Now, there's plenty of evidence that the climate which suits crocodiles has actually changed. But there's also evidence that when you look at the fossil bones, they are at sea level today. When you look at the fossil teeth, they're also higher up. Okay, so how could you have crocodiles on a high place when you are having crocodiles in the sea only north of that line? Okay, you need to think carefully, how much can the sea level change using fossil evidence? Because the fossil evidence would imply much of Australia has been underwater not all that long ago. So when the first settlers came, all that inland area, they said there has to have been a big sea here. Perhaps it's still left here. Well, there isn't one today. So both climate change and sea level change have actually affected places like my house, right? There's where I live. In fact, when you have a look, the fossil evidence you can collect, now fossil evidence is real evidence, it's still in the rocks. Now, this is not just my conclusion, because when I was a student and when it wasn't a climate change, you have to believe in it or else you're kicked out of the university, that was the statement that they were telling us all. The fossil evidence, the crocs up on the Darling Downs, the crocs around Brisbane, the crocs in those days had been found at Oxley. They hadn't dug the motorway then yet. They showed the Eastern Australian climate has changed at least 3 times. Now, if you're going to have fossil crocs from 20 million, 30 million, 50 million theoretical years, then you've got to admit there were no people here making industry. They were not able to change the sea level. Their heating had nothing to do with climate change at all. Now, I've been all over the world since then, up and down the west coast of America, up and down the west coast of England. In fact, we even learned at university, hey, the west coast is rising up. This is in England. And Joseph and I have traveled extensively, and that's certainly a case. Okay, but in Australia, you find it on a big scale. Okay, let's have a quick look. There's the Nullarbor. Okay, Nullarbor. No, that's not an Aboriginal word. It's a Latin word, null arbor. Can you guess what it might be? How many trees can you see there? Null arbor. Okay, there's a report, and you can read this, Diane, on our website. You can see all of this if you want to check it up. Here a report on a diverse and exceptionally well-preserved Middle Pleistocene So not 200 million, not even 100 million. This is the last real part, the Ice Age sort of stuff you find in the Northern Hemisphere. Pleistocene vertebrate assemblages from caves beneath the arid treeless Nullarbor Plain of South Central Australia. Now, I've got to agree with this because I've actually jumped into these caves. Yes, if you want to see the evidence of that, have a look at one of our DVDs on Darwin on the Rocks. You will see me bravely jumping into the cave. I mean, it was spectacular, but at the bottom, it was even more spectacular. There were heaps of fossils from creatures who'd either retreated to the caves or they got into the caves accidentally, then they died and dried. But look, this report says there are immense creatures, such as wombat-like rhinoceros-sized marsupials, 7-meter-long lizards, and carnivorous lions that lived in trees. Well, there's their skeleton. Now, I've got to be honest, I found one of these. It's sitting out in my back shed now, not yet prepped because there's so much preparation involved. We found it up on the Darling Downs, but you find them down in the caves on the Nullarbor as well. There's the picture from one of the big tourist attractions down there. They used to have, well, see the greenie? They used to have green plants and giant tree-dwelling marsupial lions. Look at those teeth. Man, the tooth we found in the Darling Downs, the jaw, the skull is impressive. And there's their conclusion. Giant tree-climbing kangaroo carnivores needed big trees and an abundance of plant eaters to eat. Wow. They also found that. Tasmanian tigers. Now, Tasmanian tigers have been extinct for a long time, but that was one of my first research reports. Find a fossil. I found one of them, just a fragment of it, on the Darling Downs. So perhaps we should call them Australian tigers, and the ones in Tasmania that lived into the last century, remnant tigers. They found giant kangaroos, giant wombats, and giant goannas, and tree kangaroos. Now, have you heard me emphasize trees a few times? Because we asked you, what does Nullarbor mean? Well, Nullarbor is a word that means no trees. There's hardly any plants out there. It's dry. You can access caves which show that there are animals in there that used to live on trees, in trees, on vegetation. Now, how would you end up with a Nullarbor plain that could support trees and animals that would make it essentially a forest? I mean, look at it. It's barren. Look at the sign, Nullarbor Plain, the eastern end. By the time you get to the other end, you know, no arbor trees. There are no trees there. In fact, if you want a boring drive. In fact, they build corners into this essentially straight road just to wake you up every now and then. And if you don't wake up, you drive into the sand in the desert and slow yourself down. Now, from space, great pictures. There's the Nullarbor Plain. In fact, there it is. In fact, what you find is when you get into it, it wasn't caused by humans. There's no evidence the Aborigines caused this because of their policies of burning off grass so they could throw boomerangs and spears. There's the western end. Flat as. I mean, big as too. This is not just the distance across Scotland. This is Scotland, England, Ireland and Wales, really. We didn't do it. Man didn't do it. But there's what you find when you look in from the coast. Yes, I've travelled all along here. And yes, I have an invitation to an Aboriginal conference out in one of the big mining towns later this year. And that's the view on the coast. There it is when you get to one of the volcanoes on the east. See the ground at the bottom, the white ground? That's what's underneath just the whole system of the Nullarbor. In fact, that's limestone. And when you have a look at, there's volcanic stuff on top. There's a red coating. And then you can take students, there we are, on one of our field trips. Now, can I encourage you in England, join up to Joe's field trips. If he ends up over in Tennessee in the middle part of the year, sign up with Glenn and Ruby, who are great fossil collectors. Even though Glenn's got fake knees, he does a reason. And you can go out fossil collecting in the middle Tennessee because that's your summer period. Just watch out for the ticks and all of those sort of things that can give you nasty diseases over there. But when we find beautiful fossils preserved in this limestone, these are sea creatures, scallops, pecten shells. There's no doubt about it. This whole area used to be under the ocean. Look, I mean, and we're just photographing one section of it. I'll tell you what, this is an enormous evidence. Well, actually, is it sea level change or is it the land that's risen up? You see, when you find beaches above the sea level, and we'll show you some more in a moment, you are always going to see people, the sea level has changed. Well, actually, there's two possible causes. One is the sea could have dropped, but the other evidence is the land could have risen. Whether it was slow or fast, you don't know by the data we've given you, but there is definitely a sea level change here. In fact, if you want to see more of it, here we are in Victoria. Right across, you find this same bed from end to end. Now we're on the bottom end of Port Phillip Bay. And you know what's been discovered? Down here, further out to sea and round the corner, there are old Aboriginal campsites under the water. Now, when you get up close, there's some of my grandchildren there coming on a field trip with Grandpa. And can you see the black mud at the top on the red layer there, verging into the white? Well, there's the evidence this was under the water, all right, and not all that long ago. These shells are not degraded muchly. They are part of a mud deposit. They're not washed in. This is just the regular sort of shells you find on the bottom of a sea. It's you could call it a shell bed for sure, but it goes forever and forever and forever. And underneath it is the same limestone you find across at Mount Gambier in South Australia that you find for ages. There's no doubt about it. Sea levels have changed. Okay, now don't forget, we've raised one point you need to know. Did the sea level change because the sea dropped, or did the sea level change because the land rose? Now, in my experience, the evidence favors the land rising or the land sinking. In fact, we're going to actually mention a couple of things here that touch on both. Now, I'll give you the bottom line because it was given to me at Queensland University. We're not going to discuss any reference to catastrophic nonsense like Noah's flood. Bottom rule in science, whether it's Tim Flannery, whether it's the current climate change greenies, you will not deal with the actual written evidence that predates even science. Genesis chapter 6, God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and I will destroy them with the earth. And you read about rain, you read about flood. Now, when you look at the biblical description, number one, the water rose up and covered all the surface of the earth. So you basically have proof, textual comment that there was a massive flood. And it definitely is a flood that covered the whole earth. But at the same time, when you think this through, Noah's flood, well, there was waters coming from below for another 110 years after the rain stopped. So the rain just didn't come from the top to make raindrops for the first time, like in our foot fossil. The actual rain that fell down was supplemented for at least another 110 days by the water coming out from the inside. Now, where did it get there? Well, God put it there on the second day of creation. And the third day, when the land rose up, all the water on the outside ran inside except for one patch. You realize the Bible talks both about the land having to sink so the water could come out, and then at the end of the flood, the land sank back down. So you're going to end up with two lots of information here. Here's a couple of conclusions before we actually take a question break here. Just briefly, my observations is those who are climate worshippers, and that's what I call them. They believe that we are in charge, like Tim Flannery. We're evolving into a mono-organism. And if you didn't get Craig's implication, any ant who doesn't do its share is put to death. Any human ant, that is, because you have to be excluded from the system. So don't be surprised governments are trying to minimize land ownership, minimize your control, so the organism can actually exercise control courtesy of your tax money. In fact, they'll make sure you don't get any and make all your spending digital. Climate worshippers usually want things to stay the same because their security is only in this earth. Can I make a key spiritual point before we go to our first question time? Make sure your security is in Christ and not in the things of this world, because if Noah worshipped the climate and God came along and said, hey, Noah, I'm going to whip the climate to pieces. I'm going to use it to judge the world. Well, the Bible talks about a God who's done this several times, both with heat, fog, insects, you name it. Can I encourage you, if you're not a Christian yet, make sure you don't trust in the climate, because your accuracy, well, where's our 100 mils of rain this morning overnight? It hasn't happened. It hasn't happened Jurassic Ark, and we really do need the rain. Okay, Diane, before we throw up to questions, we wanted to do this one thing that is a reminder of what's on our website.
Yes, just a couple of other things from our newsletter that we've done over the past year. We've had quite a few climate programs. Now, again, notice the inflammatory language, a climate warning. Why should flowering plants be a warning? Well, it refers to these sort of little grassy plants here, which have tiny weeny little flowers, and they grow on a tiny weeny island, which is off the tip of Antarctica there. And as you can see, it's mostly a cold, bleak place. You wouldn't want to live there. It's even colder than Britain because they have snow all year round there. But you can see a few green patches there, and they've noticed over the last few years their green patches are growing. There are more of these plants, and there are a couple of species that they found. This one here with these little flowers, and they made the point, if this goes on and on for years and years, Antarctica might end up like it was in the Pliocene or the Pliocene period. Now, when was that? Well, according to the evolutionists, it was a couple of million years ago, I think about 2.5 to 5. I'll let you geologists who know the evolutionary timetable better than I do. But anyway, supposedly a few million years ago, Antarctica had green flowering plants. Why is that a problem? Why do they have to use all of this inflammatory language? And anyway, what was going on back in the Pliocene? Who was driving around Antarctica in a 4x4 or even grazing cows there, producing lots of methane? And speaking of cows, this was a quirky, funny story that we just had to report. And have you heard the latest climate control scheme? Well, it's not a lot of bull, but you could use another word about it. And we're not making this up. Here is the report from Science, their news service. That's the journal Science, but they have an open access news service to everyone. And there we are, barnyard breakthrough. Researchers successfully potty train cows. They were trying to train cows to pee in the right place. And again, we're not making this up. This is the journal article from Current Biology, which is a highly prestigious journal. If you get an article in here, you really do have boasting rights in the science community. Learned control of urinary reflexes in cattle to help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Honestly, we're not making it up. If you want to look up the original reports, we have got links to them on our website. So this is where climate research is heading, into all sorts of strange places. Now, occasionally you'll get some good news with climate. A report fairly recent saying that, well, we can look forward to more rainbows because climate prediction, well, I doubt whether any of us will be around in 2100 to see whether this prediction comes true, but by 2100, climate change is likely to generate an increase in the mean global annual rainbow days. Oh, isn't that nice? That is, days with at least one rainbow. Yes, we all do like rainbows, and the scientists who wrote this up made a point that rainbows do have cultural significance. They even quoted from the Bible in that God told Noah the rainbow would be a sign that he wouldn't flood the earth again. The interesting thing is, in the article, they did not give the Bible reference. They actually referenced that quote to another science journal rather than to the Bible. And I wonder, what are they afraid of? Are they afraid that someone might actually pick up a Bible and look at the context of that whole story and discover why God sent the flood, as well as why he sent the rainbow? And that's an important point. Now, here's a report that's fairly recent. We haven't written this one up yet, but we will. Climate change doomed the Hittite Empire. Now, remember the Hittites? Well, you wouldn't have met many Hittites around lately because they are an extinct community, but they do rate a mention in the Bible, particularly those early chapters that Sam and his Bible reading fellows are going to be reading about fairly soon, because the Hittites were one of a number of people groups that lived in the Middle East and a little bit north up around the Anatolian region. In terms of modern geography, that's sort of southeast Turkey, Syria, that region there. The Hittites lived there, and they were one of the enemies of Israel, and they fought many battles with them. And the climate story is relating to a study of tree rings, actually, and they found evidence that there was a severe drought back in about 1190 BC. 3 years of minimal rain could have forced the ancient civilization to abandon its capital. Now, 3 years of minimal rain, that's not a drought, is it? I mean,
not to Australia.
That's right, yes, okay. And perhaps triggered the empire's ultimate collapse. Well, what really caused the empire to collapse? And who is really in control of the climate at that time? The Bible has a lot to say about droughts. Remember, Abraham experienced a drought, a famine in the land, which caused him to go to Egypt. And this is a mural that we have at Jurassic Ark. People accuse Bible-believing Christians of being climate deniers. No, we don't deny climate. There's plenty of it mentioned in the Bible, as well as from our own experience and from our own research. What we do deny is who is in charge of it, or the claims of who is in charge of it. We know who's in charge of it. Right? The Lord God, the Creator, is in charge of it. And so we need to ask, why did the Hittites really die out? Was it because of drought, or is it because of the one who was actually in charge of the climate also had something to do with the demise of the Hittites? And can we move on to some questions now?
Okay.
Diane, can I ask you a question?
Good.
You showed pictures of the island just off the coast of Antarctica that was covered in snow and ice, and now it's greening up with plants, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I was just wondering who planted those seeds.
Probably birds.
Yes. Yeah, the
And
birds
the other option,
all those seeds.
Yeah.
Yes,
The
so
other
it
option,
obviously had seeds in the soil, so it had been green previously, and we're to believe that those seeds stayed fertile for millions of years.
Yeah, that is the other option, Glenn, that they are finding that even in the ice that's been above them, there were seeds, right? And the seeds have actually germinated when they've been, the ice has melted back. But it brings me to one statement I'll make, so then we can have questions. The other factor I didn't get up to, because it's in, it's a real factor. Off the coast of South Australia, we have abundant evidence of the sea level changing because the water has been soaked up in ice. And the ice mentioned in the days of Job, that is the one factor which will remove water from the ocean levels. And it's when it's remelted again, you get even David Attenborough having to admit that the Aboriginal stories show that the barrier reef wasn't there when they first arrived, because they was about where is now beyond it in the ocean, and the water came in really quickly, and so you've got evidence of sea level change in active water gaining and in active water loss, most probably associated with the ice that first appears on the planet in the days of Job.
Wow.
I'm pretty sure that the Hittites were driven out because of their sin of the land. Weren't they one of the nations that were driven out by the Israelites when they were settling Canaan?
And
So
it is interesting, Craig, it is interesting to note that it is the Bible that actually first mentioned Hittites and it was used by the skeptics. They can't possibly be true. No one has any evidence they existed. Well, now we do, because one of the guys who actually believed the biblical record went looking for them and found them exactly where the Bible describes them. So just because the Bible is the only place where something is recorded, don't write it off. You are on provably dangerous ground historically.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
definitely. Great stuff. Well, let's have some questions now before we begin to wrap up in about 15 minutes or so. Sam, are you still around?
I'm here. Yes.
You are there. Right, over to you for some thank yous and then some questions.
Okie dokie. So Neil has sent in a question specifically for Craig. It's a very urgent question, Craig. Does Craig have a string on his hat to stop it blowing off in the extreme hurricanes that the climate change is expected to bring?
Yes, but I'm really hoping for the sun. I'm not. Yeah, we're just hanging on for that down here. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so,
But I've just in case. I've got a string just in case.
Okay.
Thanks,
Right,
thanks, Neil. Thanks for your concern, Neil.
Well, we answer the burning questions here on Creation Conversation. So we've got a question here from Neil as well. Anyone heard Thomas Sowell on climate change? He believes it's climate change is just fear-mongering academics trying to attract funding to find a solution to a problem that doesn't exist. I might be able to actually add something here. I haven't necessarily heard of Thomas Sowell, but I did see a video. Actually, it was early on today. There was this big sort of money mogul person who's heavily invested in property in the United States, and this woman was screaming at him in the audience, saying, "You know, what are you fat cats doing about when the sea levels rise?" And he told this story of when he went down to the scientific research facility on Antarctica. And they gave a presentation to him, and they said that they had thousands upon thousands of cores, and they selected like 20. And they went down, and he said, about these different layers of the cores, and they said, "Oh, it's X amount of years old, blah 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 blah." And they said, "This is the closest it's been back in time to our current sort of conditions." And basically, long story short, he ended up summarizing to the audience that because there's basically not going to be any sort of form of massive sea level change, simply because he knows that property is heavily developed with these assessments in mind. Like, for instance, about especially in Florida, he mentioned, because all of the even if the sea levels rise a certain amount, Florida's gone. So all of these properties that are being developed in Florida would just be wiped out. There'd be no point in developing them. But yet you can get loans for, getting a house in Florida. Either there's no objections, even with all of this supposed research on, climate change, and say, oh, it's a big problem. You can still, he said, with a firm, a firm stance, there is not going to be any sea level changes, simply because of what the property market is doing. So if you don't listen to any of us today, listen to the property market and the unwavering evidence behind it. But but I thought that might be something interesting to just pipe in.
Yeah, that is a reality, because Al Gore and the others invest into property right by the sea level over there on the west coast of the USA. But here's one factor that tells you how much a control is being implemented. I spoke with the chief funds officer in the UK, and we were talking about how he decides grants for scientific research. And he was quite emphatic that he had been ordered to favor projects that mention climate change. He had been ordered to not give grants to research that did not favor or in any way mention climate change. From the horse's mouth, that's how it's played, folks. So you will notice that many papers, like, what is the length of the tentacles in Miocene fossil octopus, right? And they will slip in a paragraph on climate change, right? And then you say, this has got nothing to do with digging up fossils, but it's got to do with my grants, right? So that's how the game is played. It's a political game. So your statement is an accurate one there, mate. This is done to achieve an agenda, not done to bless mankind, not done to help anybody except the guys who are selling, buy your solution here to climate change problems.
But
Well,
it
I
is
think that's go for it, Glenn. Yeah.
It's disappointing in one sense. My wife here particularly is Cajuns. Cajuns live in the swamps of Louisiana. And when I took meteorology,
That came out the wrong way, Glenn.
The question about climate change, I told him, I said, well, the sea level is going to rise. The Cajuns are naturally adapted to flooded conditions. We're going to rule the world.
Good on you.
Now you tell me we're not going to get to do that?
We're in trouble.
The
Yeah, I was just going to
professor-
add that. Sorry,
I was
yeah,
gonna-
Glenn.
The professor said he was grading papers up to like 2:00 in the morning when he came to that answer, and he said, "Thank you, you woke me up, but you still get a 0 on that question."
I was
Go
going
ahead,
to say that. So go ahead, Craig.
Oh, I was just going to say about this funding thing is exactly what the Professor Peter Ridd talks about. Is if you are not on the climate change bandwagon, you won't get funding. And I think it's probably pretty similar in other fields of science, like NASA pushing the fact that they're searching for life on other planets. I'm sure that there's probably got a lot to do with the fact that they want funding to do their space exploration, and so they use the excuse of we're looking for life on other planets or on Mars or whatever to send rovers and things there, because that's part of the current sort of paradigm that the funders are wanting to fund.
Yeah, it's well known. It's not a secret. When we get I've served on many of the panels for deciding who gets the grants. And of course, I've gotten millions in research on grants, and the call will come out and just will tell you, and you've got to put climate change on the grants.
It's something that I discovered as well going through university, is that I spent 4.5 years studying paleontology, specializing in paleobiology, right? Fossils and interpreting fossils and stuff like that. And I had 2 papers on rapid fossilization, in particular flood fossilization, right? One at Hunstanton, which is in Norfolk, one at Whitby. And I had preliminary permission to expand on that research, particularly the Hunstanton stuff with the fossil trees and the fossil sea creatures and everything, for my final dissertation, right, my final thesis. And the university changed its policy just before I was due to start to say that all geological students had to do their final thesis either on natural disasters, earthquakes, volcano, stuff like that. Well, that much interest in that side of geology, but basically on natural disasters and the impact of those, or past environmental change. So that's the closest you got to anything fossily wise, right? Past environmental change with reference to current climate change. All right, so there's definitely a push towards the climate change side of stuff. But of course, the question is, well, how do you do a final thesis on past environmental change with reference to current climate change? I said, well, can I do it at Hunstanton still and look at the evidence of climate change there? And they said, well, there is thought to be evidence of climate change there, right? You've got the Aptian and the Albion, which are the 2 sort of rock formations that meet there, and there's supposed to be a big climate change in there. But it's not just enough to do that. You've got to open it up wider. Well, how about having a look at the Aptian and Albion in the middle of the North Sea? Are you going to fund me to go take some boreholes in the middle of the North Sea? No, you need to go and actually read through papers, right? And so the entire dissertation essentially ended up being a literature review. Now, literature review is something that is very important in science, right? Particularly as part of dissertations, papers, PhDs, that kind of stuff. But to do an entire thesis with essentially no physical research was a bore first and foremost, but I ended up basically looking at my dissertation and saying, well, I've based this off of X, Y, and Z's papers, but so on and so forth have contradicted that, and you're back and forth and you're all over the place. And the conclusion was basically, we don't know, right? It's still got good marks for basically pulling all these different papers together and presenting it there. But there is definitely a push in modern academia to, number one, promote this climate change philosophy, but also number two, which I've realized, is actually move away from physically going out and digging up and seeing what's there and spending more and more time just pulling together other people's opinions and reinterpreting them in a different way. So it's part of why I'm so grateful that I'm involved with creation research, because as we spoke about last week, right, we actually go out and dig things up and put them on display. This is real research that is going on there.
Okay, one more question, Joe, then I'm going to have to go. Or
Sure
Diane,
thing.
I'll have to go.
Go on over to you, Sam.
All right then. Let's pick. This one's a good one. Sandy brings this question in. Sandy says, question, are the levels of CO2 dangerously low now due to their obsession to eliminate it?
The natural processes are going to overrule that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. One volcanic eruption and you're back to where you were used to be. And
Yes.
in fact, there's a whole article in the Quora site that I subscribe to on the eruption of 536, 46, somewhere in there, and how it changed the climate for the next year or two. And this has happened massive number of times since Noah's flood and volcanoes became an issue. So the natural process like CO2 emission out of hot springs and that, you find caves where the water is coming out, it's soda water. There's so much water coming. I went into one and the water was actually warm and it almost sort of put the CO2 level up to your knees. You wouldn't want to have fallen unconscious in that cave. But it's coming out of the ground. In fact, Coca-Cola is on record as extracting all their CO2 up to a few years ago from one spring, a CO2 spring here in Australia. And you know how much Coke they sell, right? And it's just, that's where they get their bubbles from, out of the ground. So not a problem. Don't worry about running out of CO2 while you're asleep.
Plus the soil produces, it dwarfs so many of the other sources, and the oceans buffer the CO2 levels. So
Yeah.
God designed it. It works.
Absolutely.
Yeah, there's also sort of something on that as well. Is a video clip I saw. It was Piers Morgan interviewing a vegan, and there was a point there of vegans saying, "Oh, you need to cut down on your meat because the meat industry and cows produce so much, CO2, methane, and all these unnatural things going in. It's causing climate change." And then Piers had a very good point of saying, well, you eat almonds, you drink almond milk to eat your almonds, and you have your avocados. Well, they're flown all across the world to be processed and on airplanes and ships and all these things. It is the exact same doing that as opposed to having meat. So it is literally, there is no difference in the emissions if you eat meat or if you're a vegan. So there's literally no point. You can pick it for ethical reasons if you wanted to, but just for a climate change point of view, there is no difference. And it's all about this sort of getting the idea into people's heads that our meat is dangerous and meat is this massive conglomerate of this massive problem, when actually we ship fruits all across the world all the time. If a fruit is in season in one part of the world, then it's imported into all the other countries where it's not in season. It's nonsense. But that's my 2 cents on that one.
Yeah,
Well, if you ask people,
a good example of that, Sam. I remember the last time I was in the UK, going shopping, looking for some food that I could cook with, and I often like to cook with herbs. And anyway, there was a whole shelf in which it said, shipped this morning from Israel, fresh. So if I wanted a vegan meal, I just put tons of CO2 into the atmosphere.
Absolutely. Great stuff. Well, it's about time that we wrap it up there. I've got a couple more things just to mention. Well, first and foremost, as a reminder, if you want more information on this topic, obviously there's tons of stuff on the websites, particularly on the Creation Fact File. We've got 4 specific productions on climate change and creation, a really inconvenient truth, made off the back of Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. There's your really inconvenient truth. We've got the God Factor, which deals with that sovereignty question. We've got the latest up-to-date 2020 God's Eye view of climate and change. And then finally, we have the 1.5-hour 3-part documentary special filmed in Iceland, filmed in the UK, and filmed in Australia, Fire and Ice, exploring real history, climate based in Iceland. And to finish all this stuff off, I'm going to just play a very brief trailer, it's only a minute long, of the Fire and Ice before we wrap up our birthday celebrations and say goodbye. So just very briefly, here is a little sneak peek into Fire and Ice, which is available to buy, available to stream, and available to download. G'day, I'm Indiana Joe and welcome to Iceland. We're here to explore the fire, the ice. We've come here to find out truths about the Bible. We've come here to discover climate change. And this is Iceland, land of fire and ice. Hello and welcome to this special documentary from Creation Research as we explore Iceland. Yes, Creation Research has had the incredible opportunity to come here to Iceland and film every single step of our journey. In this documentary, we will not just be looking at the all-important issue of climate change, global warming and the effects that man has on the planet, but also Iceland's history, the fire and the ice. The fire, of course, is its geology. The igneous rock creating the incredible basalt columns, the geysers warmed by the volcanic processes which burst into the sky in all of their wonder. The ice is, well, ice. The glaciers which cover 10% of the island, creating a stunning amount of scenery and beauty in this remote little part of the world. But all of this leads to one important investigation: climate change. Global warming, what are its effects on the planet? Is man causing it? And how on earth does the Bible fit into it? So join us as we give you that all-important biblical perspective of Iceland, land of fire and ice. So, let's go and explore!
Oh, no, Joe's on mute.
There we go. Great stuff.
It's great. I've watched it myself. It is genuinely a fantastic documentary. It really is top notch.
No, great. It's good. It's really good, and we had a great time both filming it as well as producing it, and it still is pretty much up to date. And of course, the great thing about it is, unlike these 3, which are basically lectures, very interesting, very important. Do go and watch them. But this is actually filmed on location around the world as we actually travel and look at physical evidence, both in the geological record, the historical record, archaeological, and so on and so forth. So it's great stuff. Do go and check it out. Grab the DVD, download it, or stream it online. All available at our website. So I think that wraps up a pretty great birthday celebration. It's great to have the whole team here. It's great to have our team grow over the last 2 years as well, and starting to get some more guests on as well, which has been really exciting. So I think we're most likely going to be having a question and answers broadcast next week, because we haven't had one of those in a while, and I think our questions have racked up significantly. But of course, the next big thing that's coming up is, and I can't quite believe I'm saying this already, but it is Easter, and we will be doing our Easter broadcasts as well. We usually have a couple dedicated on Easter and making the connection between Genesis and Jesus, and that'll be a great program to watch and tune into. But until next time, which will be next week, we will see you very shortly, and keep watching. More stuff is going up on YouTube over the next little while as well, so do keep an eye out for that.
Just before we stop, I just want to commend Craig for his absolute dedication to that
It's
hat and
brilliant,
sunglasses
isn't it? It's just,
to the entirety of this show. I doff my imaginary cap to you, sir. It
I had to take the sunnies
commendable.
off because I couldn't see the computer screen.
Great
Love it.
stuff. Great stuff. Thanks.
Good
All right,
seeing
then.
you. Craig,
It's-
we really needed you wearing that hat. We need you wearing that hat.
Yeah. I
You
feel
do
part of the
understand.
team with a hat.
I
Great
do
stuff,
have a
Mike.
hat, but I don't normally wear a hat inside. I've now that I'm up in Queensland, I have to wear a hat because I have to keep the sun off my skin. So, but
Very stylish.
I don't normally wear a sun hat inside unless there's a hole in the roof or something like that.
Well, I have a hat. I just don't have a knee. So,
Great stuff.
all right,
Thanks.
love you guys. Next week.
Good to see you all. We'll see you later. Remember the
You're
DVDs. Go and check them out and grab them. And we will see you next time on Creation Conversations. Catch you later.
Bye-bye.